Hello! Do you want your voiceover to sound a bit better? Maybe you want it to sound a lot better. Well, if you're in any of those two camps, which I'm imagining is almost everyone, then one of the things I recommend doing is setting up a voiceover plugin chain. So this is a series of effects that you apply that you can kind of save as a preset. And that's going to help your audio be a bit louder, be a bit clearer, help it cut through dense mixes of audio, and just kind of help you stand out a bit more, because raw audio is good for a lot of genres, especially high-end auditions. But if you do things like pay-to-play auditions, or you're on platforms like Fiverr, then it helps generally to be able to deliver processed ready audio. And I'm going to show you where you can kind of take this, make it very subtle, and you can also take it a bit further and make it a bit more crunchy, make it a bit more broadcast like. But generally speaking, with voiceover, you kind of want to be subtle, because it is dialogue we're looking at right here. Any additional processing which is very aggressive is purely functional. It really, if you just do, for example, audiobooks, then you really don't need to do too much. But the things you do can make a significant impact on how listenable your audio is. So let's have a look. So we are in Reaper. Anything I show you can be done in Cubase, Pro Tools, Audacity even, though the workflow is slightly different. What I've got here is I've got a recording I made. This is using my Neumann TLM 103, and no processing has been applied, so you'll listen to it raw. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. This already sounds pretty good, and the reason it sounds pretty good is because I'm using a good microphone with a good interface in a good room. If your room sounds like garbage, then there's not much you can really do to fix it. Yeah, you can make it sound a bit better, but the point is this audio, without any effects at all, already sounds pretty good. And anything we do is just going to help sweeten things, so we don't need to do that much to it. Let's start with EQ. I've got a little bit of boxy resonance at 200, and a little bit too much bass at 114 Hertz. And all I've done is I'm just cutting it a bit, 1.7 dB, 1.7 dB, and let's listen to it with it off, and then I'm going to turn it on. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But the middlemen that once offered a helping hand have now gotten out of hand. We're hearing a little bit of cleanup here in the lower frequencies. We don't have to do too much. This kind of area here is where, if you put a lot of music in the background or a lot of sounds in the background, this is the frequency range where we'll tend to have the most problems. There'll be some frequency conflicts. It can kind of make everything sound a bit muddy. We lose clarity in the lower frequencies. So it helps to just cut out some of those lower frequencies just to make everything sound a bit clearer. We also have a little bit of a drop here at 98 Hertz. I detected this after I used a compressor. But this is really just to help clear things up a little bit. So let's keep this on. Now, de-esser. A de-esser is quite simply a compressor for your sibilant frequencies. So your S's, your T's as well. And this is really just designed to help cut down on the harshness and the loudness of those S's and T's. This is TD-esser 2. It doesn't have to be this one. I got it for free. I don't know if it's still free, but any de-esser will work fine. What we're doing here is we're looking at the range of 5 to 10 kilohertz, but that's because I know my sibilance is in that range. It's, I think, between 6 and 10, or between 6 and 8 kilohertz, if I'm not mistaken. So this kind of fits right in, so I can choose this band. The only thing you might want to do is get a de-esser which has an adjustable range, where you can more specifically choose the sibilant frequencies, and you don't have to worry about it cutting out some of the detail in your voice. Even though a de-esser will always do it, it's very hard to get a de-esser to not cut out any of the clarity in your voice, and we'll have to compensate for that later. Anyway, let's listen to the de-esser. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. We're really not doing that much. And the way I've set it up is I want it to be very aggressive, but at the same time, only process a small amount of sibilant. So it's quite aggressive here, but it's only applying that aggressive reduction to a tiny portion of the audio. And what we can do here, there's a diff button here, and this can actually tell us what it's removing. And this is quite useful. If you have an option to listen to the difference, what it's going to show you is going to show you what it's cutting out. And like that, you can make sure that it's not cutting out any of your dialogue or any of the detail in your voice, and that will help it retain its more natural sound. So let's listen to it. It's only cutting out sibilants. Now, if we were to take this further and reduce the threshold or the amount of processing, so yes, it's removing more sibilants, but it's also removing some of the dialogue, and I definitely don't want it to do that. Compressors are one of those things where plug-in compressors are generally not that good. They can do a decent job, but one of the things you definitely want to avoid doing with a compressor is pushing it too hard. Sometimes it's unavoidable, where you do need more compression to make something more clear, but the objective here is to be subtle, use the processing where it's needed, and make sure that we're not going too far and the voice still sounds natural but clear. Let's have a look at compressors now. I'm using two compressors here, and they are both exactly the same. The only difference here is the settings. We are using TDR Kotelnikov, again from Tokyo Dawn Labs, so it's a free plugin. And what we have is, I'm going to apply them one by one. We have a fast compressor. So what this is doing is it's essentially acting like a peak limiter. All we want this peak limiter, this peak compressor to do, is we want it to basically chop off the bit that you see on top here. We want to reduce that. Now, some people will use a clipper for that, and clippers can work, but they don't always sound that natural. You can use a clipper just for the very, very peaks and typically get away with it. But I'm a big fan of using just a fast compressor or a limiter. I'm going to use a compressor in this case, but feel free to use a limiter just to kind of help chop off the top here, just to make it a bit more uniform. Now, the reason we're doing this is because afterwards we're going to use a slower compressor. This is a more gentle compressor, and all we're really doing here is just reducing the dynamics a little bit, just to make everything sound a little bit more consistent, a bit more clear. The reason why we need to compress dialogue is that we really don't want there to be too many differences between the loudest and the quietest audio. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit more difficult for us to listen to it. It's going to be more difficult for people to be able to understand what you're saying when you go from loud to quiet. And that's why we need compression. But we want to do it in a way that's tasteful. We don't want it to just pump the audio so much that it sounds like you're a radio announcer, though you can do that if you want. But really what we're looking for here is we're looking for something that you basically can't hear. So TDR is off. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. I think I could probably get this to compress just a bit more. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in... I do hear the compression a little bit, but I do think it's fine. I'm probably just going to reduce it a touch because I really don't want to hear it that much. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. And the key thing here is it's not compressing the second part of this section here. All I really want it to do is compress the louder part. So I'll remove the cycle here and listen to the whole thing. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But the middlemen that once offered a helping hand have now gotten out of hand. So all this is doing is compressing the louder part. So as we get some bumps in volume, so if I get slightly louder, This is doing a good job of kind of just bringing it down, making it a bit more level. And one of the things of compression here is when you apply compression, you're reducing the volume. So for the next stage, so this will be this is the softer compressor, the slower compressor. I've actually applied a bit of makeup gain, and that's going to help to compensate for the loudness reduction. This is doing a good job of kind of just bringing it down, making it a bit more level. All that we've done here is a series of volume reductions in specific areas to make everything sound a bit more uniform. And now we actually need to compensate for it. And all of this processing is removing the bad stuff and helping us pump up the good stuff in very, very simple, unscientific terms. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to remove the makeup gain so you can hear only the processing, and then we're actually going to increase this because we have effectively gained about 1.5 dB of headroom, which means we can make this voiceover 1.5 dB louder, which is going to make our auditions louder, it's going to make our voiceover jobs louder, it's just going to sound better overall because we can bring up the volume. But I've removed it and I'll put it on later. So this is the soft compressor. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But the middlemen that once offered a helping hand have now gotten out of hand. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. The interesting thing here is if we turn off all the effects and then turn what we have on, what we should hear is we're essentially at roughly what sounds like roughly the same volume, even though this is technically quieter than the raw audio. Let's listen. Off. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. So overall, this is a very similar loudness, but interestingly enough, with effects is actually quieter. Now, what I'm hearing is the de-esser it does sound like it's cut away a little bit of the high frequency detail, and we will need to compensate for that. But let's apply the makeup gain. Now, I've already set this, so you would have to test this yourself, or I'd have to do this for you if you want to work with me on that. And let's now listen to the same processing, but with the volume being the same for both. So effect off and effect on have exactly the same volume now. So let's turn it off. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But the middlemen that once offered a helping hand have now gotten out of hand. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. I don't need to go through all of this. You can hear the nice parts of the voiceover have been brought up. All you're hearing is basically the good stuff. I don't know why I've switched to using this vocabulary. Now, there are some extra things that we can do. This would be a very good natural chain, and what you might want to do in this case is consider perhaps reducing the two compressors if you don't need it to be if you don't need it to be really loud. But even then, I think this sounds pretty natural. You don't really hear the processing much. It does sound a little bit more polished, a bit more clear. So overall, just a good thing. And I'm using free plugins. So now we've looked at a series of things that you can do to make your audio a bit clearer, a bit louder, while still retaining a more natural sound. So now we're going to apply a bit more processing that kind of helps to push it higher, make it a bit clearer, a bit louder. Though this would be more useful if, for example, you have music in the background and you want to help cut through that audio. The first one here is something called saturation. Now, saturation is one of those things where it basically adds harmonic distortion. Now, it really depends on who you ask, but the right kind of distortion can kind of help make your voice sound a bit thicker, give it a bit more perceived volume. And this is one of the features of, for example, a lot of analog hardware equipment. So that's why somebody might use something like an Avalon. It's why a lot of people like some of the older hardware, some of the older stuff. This could be one of the reasons why, is that we have a little bit of this distortion. Now a lot of modern hardware sounds extremely almost neutral to a fault, almost surgically and almost uncomfortably clear and precise. this helps bring us back to a more, I don't know, vintagey sound, a more distorted sound, which, again, we're being very subtle here because this is voiceover. It's not singing, it's not a musical instrument. But speaking of musical instruments, you could think of this almost like what you would do with a guitar, with an electric guitar, where you give it that distortion to kind of help sort of bring it forward. And that's exactly what we're doing with voiceover, but in an extremely subtle way. And actually, what I'm going to do here is, just to make it very clear, let's take it all the way up to 100%. And don't worry about this graph, it's just a visualizer of some sort. Let's keep it off and then we'll turn it on. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. So we've brought it forward. It sounds a bit louder, it sounds clearer, it technically is louder, that's what saturation does. But I think this is too much. I think it's too crunchy. So I actually had it set, as you may have seen already, to 25%, because I do want to be subtle. I don't want to hear the processing. I want the advantages of the processing, but I don't want to hear the processing itself. I want people to listen to me and think, oh, this is a person's voice. It's not an enhanced voice. So once again, we'll listen to it off, and then I'm going to turn it on. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. So it's just bringing everything up a little more, while not really sounding like much is being done to it in terms of processing. It just sounds clearer, louder. This is one of those things where you will probably not need most of the time, but if there's maybe a louder mix, if there's music in the background, this can really help to kind of make things cut through a little bit more clearly. It makes your voice a bit more clear. But let's leave it on for now, and let's look at the next two effects. One that I quite like is the Era De-esser Pro from Acusonus. Now, interestingly enough, Acusonus, I think the company went bust, so these plugins are actually available for free, even though they were originally paid plugins. And I quite like their De-esser Pro, so let's actually listen to that. I have some settings in mind already. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. Society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as Now, I want to take this too far so you can hear what too much de-essing does. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. So you don't really want to take de-essers too far, otherwise you start sounding like Mike Tyson. So let's bring this back. I think 40% is a good number. You may want to take this further, it just depends. But generally speaking, with this processing, if you're not sure that you're doing enough, don't do more. You probably just want to do a bit less than you think, because one of the things to keep in mind here is that I'm listening on professional mixing and mastering headphones. You really want to be careful and subtle with this. Let's listen to it again, off and then on. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. This, I think, is doing a better job than TDR Nova. So if you can find the Acusonus plugins, the Era 6 ones, those are available for free, which is nice. It's a good set of plugins. I quite like. I'm quite a fan of the de-esser. We're now going to look at our last piece of the chain, which is another instance of TDR Nova, which is just another EQ in this case. And we are simply doing a high frequency lift, a very subtle one. De-essing twice, and we have two instances of a de-esser here. Even though they were subtle, they do remove some high frequency detail. So what we're doing here is we want to bring it back so that we get similar high frequency loudness without all the extra sibilants. So let's listen to it again. We're just going to use this section of audio again. This is off. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. I think we can probably make this a bit louder. Just a bit. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. I would probably take that down a bit, but this kind of depends also on the track that you have. If you've got if you have something that's a bit more dense in terms of music, then you might actually want to push this further. I have seen audio post producers like do something ridiculous like that, like really jack up the high frequencies. And just for our entertainment, let's listen to it. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. That is a little crunchy, a little bit too much. Now, for the pièce de la résistance, we are going to listen to all of the audio with no plugins, and then we're going to turn our chain on, and you can be the judge as to whether or not you think it's an improvement or not. Let's listen. Off, peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But the middlemen that once offered a helping hand have now gotten out of hand. Peer-to-peer. That's how we started. But as society evolved, we brought in middlemen to make things easier. But the middlemen that once offered a helping hand have now gotten out of hand. So yeah, if you're interested in me doing something like this for you, then feel free to contact me and we can have a look at your audio. If you think this is enough for you and you're happy to start diving in deep and using audio software to help improve the quality of your sound, then all the more power to you. Anyway, my name is Mark. I hope this has been useful. And for the first time, because I keep forgetting to do it, subscribe to the channel and like the video if you found it useful. Bye-bye.